Thanks everybody online for joining, and everybody in the room. So I don't know a lot of you. The first year. I'm Kirsten Olson. I am a professor in the department. Good to see all your new faces. But today we're here for the seminar, and Dr. Chip Fletcher, who is the interim dean of SOAST, the School of Ocean, Earth Sciences and Technology here on campus. He is a climate scientist and has been really influential in the state and beyond in climate policy, taking climate action, gives really good talks. So we are looking forward to today. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks, Kirsten, and thanks everybody for coming. I'm going to basically talk about a paper I recently published, Earth at Risk, an urgent call to end the age of destruction and forge a just and sustainable future, which is the title of this talk. I think it's 16 co-authors from the Southern Hemisphere, the Northern Hemisphere, from developing nations, from the developed world, lawyers, artists, historians. And so this was a group project. And what it does is attempt to link together 5 global emergencies. Climate change, of course, biodiversity loss, which I know you guys are particularly interested in, pollution, disease, and social inequality. And the paper marches through these and attempts to identify linkages between these, because just working on one is not going to be enough anymore. That would have been great 40 years ago, but we missed the boat on solving these global emergencies. We now have to work on all of them. And the paper calls for a culture change, basically a shift away from wealth-oriented privilege, profit, economics, and a shift into resiliency and sustainability as legitimate, real reasons for having economic exchange. The paper's up to about 49,000 views. It came out in April and it's been cited 7 times already. So these are pretty good numbers. I've got papers that are 30 years old that have been cited once and that have, 3 views. So this one's worked its way up to the top of my CV. And the manual here. Oh, come on.
I don't have it. Sharing here.
Hang on while I figure out how to advance the slides. That's not usually a problem. There we go. So I'm going to talk about climate change, heat, food and water, scarcity, biodiversity loss, social inequality, and the sustainability transition that we need to engage in. So here is the history of Earth's surface temperature month by month, counting through the last century and a quarter. You can see the slow rise of the mean annual and month-to-month surface temperature. And the remarkable thing is the breakout that occurred last year. That's this big, thick red line. It was just, as climate scientists around the world watched month by month in 2023, beginning in May and June, we were just astonished at the heating going on and very worried about something happening that we didn't understand. And we still do not understand why this heating was so dramatic. This is an update of that. In orange is 2023 and in red is this year. So we're now on to 14 consecutive months of record global air temperature. And when you look at the sea surface temperatures around the world, it's even a more dismal story. This includes sea surface temperatures as well as continental air temperatures. The sea surface temperatures are just ridiculously hot. You may have seen headlines last summer in 2023 that the temperature around The Keys, the Florida Keys, was over 100 degrees. Have you ever been in a hot tub? Literally, that's the temperature of a hot tub. And how are corals supposed to survive that and the other organisms that live on coral reefs? So the NASA data looks like this from 1880. These are individual annual mean temperatures. And generally speaking, the ones below the red line are La Niñas or volcanic eruptions that have temporarily blocked sunlight. And the ones above the red line tend to be El Niños. So the Pacific ENSO process really does control the global thermostat. And there's another feature of this record, which is very interesting. First of all, I always forget to point out, we've reached 1.5 degrees Celsius for the first time. And many of you know why that's important, and I will cover it in a second. We also have this acceleration that took place with the passage of a series of Clean Air Acts. We came off of World War II, global warming was starting to take off, but after World War II, we became a manufacturing society, transitioning from an agrarian society to manufacturing. There were no air pollution laws preventing manufacturing from spilling lots of aerosols. And so we temporarily blocked the sun, shadowed the sun for a couple of decades until we passed clean air laws. And with the clean air and saving millions of lives per year with that clean air, by the way, we also set loose an acceleration in climate change. There's also what's known as the stair steps of denial. And these are these temporary plateaus in temperature that occur until usually a super El Nino breaks out of a plateau in temperature, boom, then you go up to the next plateau. And 2023 was a breakout year. Looks like 2024 is going to be an even warmer year, and probably, based on history, the beginning of sort of a plateau of half a dozen years, plus or minus, before the next super El Nino that takes us out. But I will note that the El Nino for 2023 was not a super El Nino. It was a rather modest El Nino. So we're now heating up the system so that we don't need great big El Nino events to bust through into record-setting territory. And Sunday, July 21st of this past summer was the hottest day in recorded history until Monday, July 22nd. This is the CO2 record from Mauna Kea, from Mauna Loa. About 80% of anthropogenic global warming is caused by CO2. There's a complex relationship, which actually, once you warm the air, you have more humidity in the air, and water vapor is actually the most powerful greenhouse gas. But we all learned in third grade that water vapor has about a 10-day cycle. And so you have to get water vapor up there through some other mechanism, which in this case turns out to be CO2 and other greenhouse gases. And at the beginning of our measurement of CO2 on Mauna Loa, it was increasing at less than 1 part per million per year, and now it's increasing at over 2 parts per million per year. So there's an acceleration in CO2. Despite all the good news about renewable energy, this is really what we have to pay attention to, and we have to turn this trend over. Once we start turning that trend over, we'll know we're actually doing something worthwhile. Oh, that was a little harsh. 40% of the CO2 we emit today will still be in the atmosphere in a century, and 20% will be there in 1,000 years. So CO2 does go through the carbon cycle. It's complex, but it's this long-lived nature of CO2 in our atmosphere that is the big problem. Once it's up there, you're essentially causing, from a human point of view, permanent climate change. And so recognizing this, the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, which is simply the office in the UN that deals with climate change, and puts on every year conferences of parties. Every nation is a party. And there were conferences every year, climate conferences, also known as COPs, excuse me. And the COP in 2015 was held in Paris, and the nations all agreed to stop global warming before it reached 2 degrees Celsius by reducing their greenhouse gas emissions. And with the vote of that language, the Pacific Island nations walked out, saying that 2 degrees was a death sentence. They were immediately joined by the United Kingdom and by Australia. And so additional wording came out to pursue efforts to end warming before 1.5 degrees C. And the rule of thumb then became 1.5 to stay alive. And a report came out shortly thereafter. What will the world look like at 1.5 degrees? And it's just a long list of real nastiness, from hot temperatures to species loss, very serious impacts to the marine ecosystem, increased disease, decreased food and water security, decreased human safety, and increased human inequality. So these issues that were in the paper I talked about, they've been well known and documented for a long time. All of these issues have a connection to climate change. So it's fair to ask, what is our progress on stopping warming at 1.5 degrees C? And so we have time on the bottom axis and emissions on the vertical axis in billions of tons of CO2 per year, or gigatons. This was the history with 2019 being the record-setting year until we went into the COVID lockdown. In 2020, our CO2 emissions fell 5.4% around the world. I'm not talking about the US. And then with the development of a vaccine and the release of stimulus funding around the world to rev up the economic engine again, our CO2 emissions rose to a new record in 2021. They rose 6.3% above 2020. Following that, in the next year, they rose another 1.2. Last year, they rose 1.1, and they're on track to rise about 0.9% above 2023 still. Remember, emissions have to fall, not rise, and here's the pathway. The pathway to arrest global warming at 1.5 degrees is called net zero, and it means that any additional emissions need to be matched by removal of CO2 somehow. But the actual promises and pledges of the world's nations, most recently at the most recent COP, put us on a pathway to 2.3 degrees Celsius. So that's what everybody has promised. But when you examine the investments and energy policies of the world's nations, the reality is that we're on a pathway to about 3 degrees Celsius, 2.9 degrees Celsius. And this, of course, represents a gap. And so every year, the UN, before the COP, it should come out in November, publishes what's known as the gap report. And the gap report last year was called the Broken Record, which has lots of interesting connotations. And it tells us that greenhouse gas emissions need to be cut by 28% by 2030 to stay within 2 degrees C. And based on current commitments, they will only be cut by 2%. And net zero pledges cover about 80% of emissions, but most are hollow and lack implementing mechanisms. And limiting warming to 1.5 C would require global emissions cuts of 9% per year. Notice, even under the pandemic, emissions dropped only 5.4%. And so for this reason, the target of 1.5 is no longer practical. So we're walking away from 1.5. And the new modeling target is 2 degrees C. Globally, governments still plan to produce more than double the amount of fossil fuels in 2030 than would be consistent with stopping warming at 2 degrees C. So we are well off even that target. And there are some things out there that are not accounted for in the United Nations calculations. One is methane, which was rising in the late 20th century. It stabilized for a little bit, with the demise of the Soviet Union. And then it's taken off again, and it's really accelerated in the last couple of years. And the thinking is that part of that is due to the increase in a number of very large wetlands, especially in Africa. And of course, wetlands are places of organic decay, producing CO2 and methane. And one of the rules of thumb of climate change is that wet places get wetter and dry places get drier. So these new large wetlands are a response to the global warming we have set in motion, and they are releasing methane into the air. And the question is, does nature no longer need us to continue global warming? Has it been set loose? Have we poked the dragon enough so that now it's really quite upset? 1 ton of methane released is equivalent to releasing 80 tons of carbon dioxide over a 20-year time frame. Methane has a much shorter time frame. It's about 12 years or so. So if we can cut our methane emissions, it'll cycle out of the atmosphere much quicker. So that's one issue that is not accounted for by the UN. Another issue is carbon dioxide pulled down by the continental biome, by the photosynthetic community on land. So of our CO2 emissions every year, about 88% comes from burning fossil fuels. About 12% comes from land use, which includes industrial agriculture, where soils turn into sources of CO2, and deforestation. And of this CO2, about 47% goes into the air, trapping heat. About 31% is pulled out of the atmosphere by the terrestrial biome, and about 26% is dissolved in the ocean, causing a carbonic acid, ocean acidification. I'll show you some papers suggesting that we're reaching the limit, the thermal limit of photosynthesis. And these are just a series of screen grabs of prominent journals that remind us plant photosynthesis removes CO2 from the air, but plants also respire, releasing CO2 to the air. And photosynthesis has a heat limit. And beyond this, it sharply declines, but respiration continues. You're basically looking at what they call leaf death, or the demise of the plant metabolism because it's too hot. Carbon uptake by land plants is degraded, and models suggest that we're going to see a 50% cut in carbon uptake by 2040. This paper from Proceedings of National Academy of Sciences says, numerous studies suggest that a variety of ecosystems are already operating at or near their thermal thresholds. And this paper came out in 2022. We don't hear much about this. Maybe it's being taught in your classrooms, but the average person is not aware of this. This is the sort of thing, the methane keeps me up at night. Now the methane wakes me up at night, and this keeps me up at night. This is very worrisome. The world is growing hotter, especially on land in the summer. This is a paper, The Emergence of Heat and Humidity Too Severe for Human Tolerance. Here's another one, Escalating Global Exposure to Compound Heat Humidity Extremes. Business as usual emissions will lead to, and they had to come up with creative names, super and ultra extreme heat waves that are released. I like to think the authors were arguing, no, super is bigger than ultra extreme. No, ultra extreme. We're entering unnavigated territory. Deadly heat waves projected for the densely populated ag regions of South Asia. And this paper, published by Proceedings of National Academy of Sciences in 2020. So what you see here is a couple of dark spots in the deep Sahara Desert, less than 1% of Earth's land surface, which are too hot for human existence. And as we continue our emissions, remember, we're on a track of 2.9 degrees C before the end of the century. At 2.7, all of the brown hatching areas become equivalent to the deep Sahara. And we're talking about 1/5 of Earth's land surface. Of course, this will set in motion and has already set in motion a tide of human relocation because food and water security becomes very compromised under these conditions. In fact, already for each additional 1 degree Celsius of warming, it's estimated that 1 billion people will be displaced. And if you pay attention, we're seeing this play out. This is this past summer. Here is the Central Valley of California. 25% of US food comes from that location, and the temperature reached 126 degrees Fahrenheit. I was reading articles. Of course, this is also a social justice issue because these are Latino workers for the most part. And they had to start work before sunrise and they could only work until about 9 a.m. And then they would start up again at sunset and they would work deep into the night because during the day, it was just too deadly to work. This is India. Again, this past May, the entire nation at 125 degrees Fahrenheit. The world's most populous country. Everything except the Himalayas. 125 degrees Fahrenheit. We have already put 9% of humanity outside the livable zone, more than 600 million people. Climate change and expanding human needs have led to water and food impacts. So this map shows us how much drawdown of continental aquifers we are doing that exceeds natural recharge. And in the continental US, we are pulling 17% more water out of the ground than nature puts back. So you see this decline in the water table of these huge, massive aquifers. And we're one of the best. China, it's 22% more. India, it's 52%. And in the Middle East and North Africa, we are drying up aquifers. By 2050, demand is projected to grow by half. So at the same time that we need more fresh water, we are running out of sustainably maintained water. 2.2 billion people currently live in areas where over 80% of their water is depleted annually. All these orange areas in North America, all these orange areas in Europe and Asia and Africa. The truth is, you and I live in a wealth bubble. We live in a very privileged position, which is the result of 500 years of colonialism. I'll get into that in a second. This is how most of the world lives. And drought affected 1.8 billion people in 2022 and 2023, nearly 1/4 of all people on Earth, the vast majority of whom live in low and middle income countries. Many folks do not realize that rice, corn, soy, and wheat, the 4 cereals, lose micronutrients as the CO2 rises in the air. They replace protein with carbohydrate. They have less zinc, less vitamin B complex, and less iron. And this is borne out, especially by wheat, which provides 1/5 of all human protein. Wheat is threatened, the wheat yield is threatened every year by wildfire, drought, flood, higher CO2 causing the micronutrient loss. By 2050, demand for wheat will increase 60%, but the projections for the actual yield show a decline of 15%. So this is a recipe for price spikes, food shortages, and ultimately food riots. And rich nations, developed nations having to support communities that are experiencing this firsthand. 1 in 11 people worldwide went hungry last year, while 1 in 3 struggled to afford a healthy diet. And by 2050, an additional 300 million people will be malnourished and 1.5 billion women and children likely to have some form of anemia, iron deficiency because of this loss of micronutrients. This presents a global security issue. And even as scenarios of low warming, each region of the world will face severe risks to national and global security just in this first half of the decade. Higher levels of warming will pose catastrophic and likely irreversible global security risks over the course of the rest of the century. This is a quote from a report from the Council on Strategic Risks. Okay, so all that is climate change. And at the same time, we are strip mining natural resources off of this planet. We are engaging in a pervasive human-driven decline of life on Earth, pointing to the need for transformative change. This was published by Sandra Diaz in Science magazine. This was a very important paper. In it, she and her co-authors say that since 1970, per capita, per person consumption has increased by about 60%, and global economic activity has grown fourfold. Much of this growth has come at the expense of the natural world, which has increasingly managed to keep up with rising demands for food, energy, timber, paper, minerals, and more. She describes this as an unparalleled appropriation of nature, causing the fabric of life on which humanity depends to fray and unravel. A lot of this has to do with food production. Since 1970, food crop production increased threefold, and half of all agriculture expansion has come at the expense of forests. More than half of deforestation is to raise cattle and the grain to feed them. 50% of habitable land, 2/3 of all freshwater use is for food production. Over 80% of farmland is used for livestock, but it produces just 18% of human food calories. Cattle and the grain they eat use 1/3 of the available land surface on Earth and 16% of available fresh water. 1/3 of worldwide grain production is to feed cows so that you can have a cheeseburger. And that industry, the fast food industry, has a business model that preys on under-resourced communities. Under-resourced communities always have $10 to go in and grab a meal. They have now moved from the under-resourced neighborhoods in the United States to entire nations, moving into nations of Central America, Africa, and Southeast Asia as they exploit the addiction to beef. Producing beef generates 100 times more greenhouse gas than plant-based food. And part of this is a narrative of stolen lands. Over the past 5 centuries, European powers seized millions of acres from indigenous communities across the global south and elsewhere. And during decolonization, these land grabs were never reversed. Instead, new governments were stood up. The land passed straight into the hands of newly created countries in all parts of the world outside Europe. And these governments, in order to get revenue, sold the rights for logging, mineral mining, agriculture, and development. And this resulted in deforestation, indigenous erasure, soil erosion, watershed pollution, biodiversity loss. 86% of all land mammals are now livestock or humans. 70% of birds are chickens or other poultry. Less than 3% of Earth's land surface remains faunally intact. Human overconsumption, population growth, intensive farming has destroyed 69% of vertebrate wildlife in the last 55 years. This biodiversity loss is linked to the spread of disease. We've now entered the era of pandemics. 335 new infectious diseases since 1970. 75% of these are zoonotic, meaning that they originate where they jump species from animals into human communities. Ebola, HIV, malaria, West Nile, anthrax, encephalitis, Zika, SARS, MERS, and most recently, well, COVID-19 most recently is H5N1, which is the avian flu that's spreading around the world. These are called spillover events, and there are 4 venues where they occur. The first is biodiversity loss or habitat loss, roughly 1/3 of new zoonotic diseases are directly attributed to habitat loss, deforestation. About 50% of the world's original forests have now been eliminated, and globally, despite all the tree planting efforts, we are still experiencing a net loss of about 10 billion trees per year on this planet. The second venue is vector expansion. The tropics are expanding. Mice, mosquitoes, ticks, deer, and other vectors, other carriers are moving into human communities. The third venue is extreme weather events. The main thing to worry about immediately following a disaster, once you are engaged in the recovery of a disaster, is that you have months of disease to worry about. Human immunity, human immune systems are weakened because of poor availability of fresh water and food. And flood, wildfire, and heat bring pathogens and humans together. And there's concentrated animal feeding operations. So let's build a closed barn, let's put in thousands of birds, and let's keep them alive with antibiotics and antiviral medicines. And when there's a dead bird, let's pull it out and put another live one in. By doing that, we have eliminated the natural bottleneck to viral and biotic evolution towards less virulent strains. New strains are created that can find a successful mode by killing its hosts. Out in nature, bacteria and viruses that get really good at killing their hosts do not have a long survival life. It's the tendency towards moderating the virulency of strains is a natural pattern. But when we have concentrated animal feeding operations, we are promoting the evolution of highly dangerous strains. We keep these animals alive with antibiotics, nearly 2/3 of which are sold of the drugs important for human medicine are sold for food animal use. And of course, this results in the parallel problem of bacterial resistance. Disease, environmental damage, climate change, and human inequality form an amplifying feedback. Disadvantaged groups suffer disproportionately, resulting in greater inequality, either the stresses of climate change or the shocks of climate change. The ratio between the income of the richest and poorest 10% on the planet is 25% larger than it would be in a world without global warming. The richest 10% of the global population owns over 3/4 of all global wealth. The poorest half of us owns just 2% of global wealth. Climate change amplifies that. Population growth on this planet, imperialism, which is the tendency of a community to exert its will on another community, and an extractive relationship with nature have led to these 5 global crises. And these global crises result in all of the ills that you're familiar with: polluted runoff, sewage, disease, wealth disparity, impoverishment, border conflict, pandemics, heat waves, wildfire, extreme weather, sea level rise, coral bleaching, record floods. I'm not holding back. We must urgently redefine our relationship with nature and each other as one of reciprocity, regeneration, and social justice. And it's not just us academicians who know this already. This has to filter into the big banks, the big corporations. They need to see that profit is not sustainable. Sustainability is sustainable. We know the solutions to mitigate climate change: clean energy, removing market distortions, decarbonizing buildings, properly auditing these carbon offset contracts that are now a big part of the market, decarbonizing manufacturing, ending unsustainable consumption, shifting to electric vehicles, increasing public transport, decarbonizing travel, halting deforestation, eliminating environmentally harmful market subsidies, reducing food loss, investing in low and middle income nations, forgiving their debt, and creating social tipping points. Society must recognize the immoral nature of fossil fuels. And if you have any question, fossil fuel companies have been lying to us for decades and they have bought off Congress. There is a paper published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences that says for every member of the House of Representatives and the Senate, they will vote against environmental legislation in parallel with the contributions from the oil and gas industry. It's a beautiful, simple study. And so we have a corrupt government when it comes to these environmental issues. We also are accelerating our demand for energy. Even as renewable energy increases, and this is from the year 2000 up to the present in the United States, this is clean energy, this is natural gas and crude oil. So we've done amazing things with clean energy, but we are demanding more energy. Electric vehicles, increased air conditioning, and more than anything else, the AI revolution. In fact, they decided to turn back on 3 Mile Island, a failed nuclear power plant, in order to fund the AI energy demand of Microsoft. We're engaged in a sustainability transition. Yes, we have to cut carbon emissions. That's called mitigation. We have to adapt to climate hazards. That's called adaptation. And Assessment Report 6 for the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change tells us about a new term called climate resilient development, which means we have to do these through a social lens to the underserved societies first. And we have to do it all. And we can't stop here. We have to engage in public health, expansion of public health availability, affordable housing, education, water resources, overconsumption, disease, biodiversity loss, pollution. All of these need to be dealt with. You need to vote for politicians who will deal with these. We can't just get carbon tunnel vision, although this is extremely important. We don't choose the times we live in. The only choice we have is how to respond. Is that Lord of the Rings? I think that was Lord of the Rings, paraphrase. So I'll stop lecturing you now and we can take any questions if I left any time.
Okay, we've got some clapping hands online. Online, if you want to put some questions in the chat, or raise your hand and we can call on you, but we'll allow the students in the room and audience in the room to go first. Chip, do you want to field them? Yeah.
No, will you field the questions?
Okay, sure. Yeah, sure.
What sector, industry, or group of people do you see as leading, like, the most effect on the climate change, the most, like, pollutants or emissions that are contributing to it? Like, what would be the core group industry to focus on?
That sort of translates into the question of what can we do individually, and that's eat less meat, eat a more plant-based diet. So the agriculture sector is a big one, and they need to be treating the soil better with soil. Where are you? Is she here? With soil amendments and cover crops and things like that, like, you know, the ag fields of the world could solve this problem roughly by mid-century if they all went to regenerative farming, pumping carbon into the soil and keeping it there. So they are a big trigger. They're a big lever that we can pull. The way to pull that lever is for governments to give subsidies to farmers, because farming is a cutting edge business. Making a profit farming is not easy. That's why most of the mom and pop farms have been bought up by big industrial agriculture companies. But governments need to subsidize. There are a lot of different ways to do that. Farmers, but they have to tie to those subsidies regenerative farming practices. So that's a big one. And then vote.
Yeah, jumping off that, I guess, what about the United States military?
You read Civil Beat this morning?
Yes.
I came here expecting rotten tomatoes. So the military funds my research into climate resilient development for underserved communities in Hawaii. My research group models 7 different mechanisms that sea level rise will impact our communities. And we get funding from the military because they realize they can't just exist inside the fence line. They are very dependent on communities outside the fence line. And going through the gates of our military installations every day are thousands of individuals and businesses. So we are very connected to the military. And they are very sorry about polluting our water and stealing our land. And they have set up a new office in the state government in DBET of military relations in order to try and begin to mend the relationship with Hawaii. Now, as far as the ARL, which is up there in Manoa, I don't get any funding through them, but I know the director, Margaret Thompson. She's an old friend of mine and I trust her. So that's all I have to say about the military right now.
Right on.
But I also agree with you that it's a very problematic relationship. Yeah.
You're working on something that I think many of the younger members of this group are aspiring to build careers in. So you grew up at a time when this wasn't the thing that you were always hearing about.
Yeah.
all the time. I wanted to ask if there was a moment where climate change, these large issues really crystallized into the main focus of
Yeah,
your work.
Al Gore's first movie. I will never forget sitting in the movie theater and he was drawing 800,000 years of ice core CO2 record. And I was like, I teach that. Why didn't I make this movie? Why aren't I out there in the public?
Yeah.
So that movie of his gave me a backbone. And I started expressing my views because I was comfortable with everything that he was teaching in that movie. I already was teaching it, and this was in the 80s, back in the Holocene. So that was a moment. That was a career defining moment and a personal defining moment for me. Thank you. Yep.
Thank you, first of all.
Yep.
I think that was really overwhelming at the same time, but also very inspiring. You talked, your paper, you talked a little bit about planetary boundaries, and there's also solutions in UN and the COP when they meet, the emphasis on cutting emissions, right? But there's also the need of sort of power imbalances and disproportionate sort of carbon emitters out in the globe. And when they talk about those, like how to cut the emissions and stop the business as usual activity, rather move away from fossil fuel, there is also like the different parts of the world that hasn't reached the planetary boundaries, right?
Yep.
Like Pacific, Southeast Asia, Africa, they haven't meet that boundaries. Meanwhile, the global north, that's called, is like exaggerated.
You're raising a very important point.
Yeah. So then there's also like that filters down to problems with like population growth. It's like, yeah, it's a problem, but it's also consumption differences. Like people in global north consume 4 or 5 times more than people in the south. Then how does that filter to when it's like you need to cut emissions for different countries, and like how does the equity balance?
Right. So the developing world deserves all of the medical, educational, transportation. They deserve all the same attributes, social infrastructure that the global north has. The solution to this, actually, one of my favorite solutions is military. Why don't we take the US military, put their guns over here and give them hammers and screwdrivers and unleash them as a construction force for India and China. China, by the way, actually doesn't need it. They are making incredible headway. They reached their 2030 goals either this year or next year. They're doing wonderful things. But this is where in the paper we call for not grants or loans to the developing world, but gifts that and I suppose it would be grants.
Yeah.
The global north needs to assist the developing world to decarbonize and accelerate on a sustainability pathway. And that's a big message that has surfaced in the last COP. It's getting suppressed in the current COP, but it's a big message now that a lot of people are trying to pay attention to. So thank you for bringing up that point. Yes, sir.
I had the great privilege in Imperial being in the same department as Jim Ski. He's the chair of the IPCC. He would agree with everything you say. He also says that all of the social drivers are pointing in the wrong direction. We're talking about net consumption in the middle class in the developing world, and every other driver you can think of. So I said to him, walking back from a presentation like this, Jim, is it actually too late? And he said, well, Mark, officially I have to disagree with you.
No, it's not too late.
But
There's going to be a future. It's up to us to decide what it's going to look like. We could have a very tribal, warring future. We could see an enormous decline in the human population. And we could live in a hot, polluted, and very separated set of communities. But I really don't think that's going to happen. There's an amazing sustainability transition taking place. Would have been good 40 years ago or even 20 years ago, but it's happening now. We probably will see the use of coal and oil plateau in the next year or three and start to decline. In the United States, it's now cheaper to put in industrial solar and battery than it is to mine coal. So finally, renewable energy is becoming the most affordable, the cheapest option when it comes to new energy demands. So that was a key thing that happened actually about 10 years ago. COVID interrupted progress on that, but we are in the midst of a sustainability transition, but we have also unleashed the hounds of hell on ourselves. We just need to get through that in a way that we remain unified and focused on sustainability, and I think we will. Yeah.
Sorry, I want to lean on your insight as an educator that you said you were earlier. This is a phenomenal talk. Now, my question is, how do you talk about this with people who aren't in these rooms and these conversations, right? Because it's safe to assume that all of us here, we think about this every day.
I don't bother with them.
Yeah.
I'm just trying to motivate the choir here.
What I asked is because just during this talk, I could think of about 3 people that are dear to me, right, in my life, that probably would have pitched a fit about 3 or 4 different times throughout that talk.
Yeah.
So how do you talk about these topics with people?
I actually don't go out looking for them, but when they come up, I'm happy to engage. Happy to engage. There are lots of sociological tricks, like speak to them through saving money, find some common ground, don't use trigger terms like climate change. You can do all that stuff, but I prefer just to like hash it out across the table with facts and figures and challenge them to go ahead, refute these, because you can't. But it's a big problem in the United States, not globally.
So I'm gonna go online for a second because we got a queue of
Okay.
questions.
We'll get to you.
And we'll
She's
bounce.
been trying.
Okay, go with that. and then
Okay.
we'll go.
I think we're-
That was literally my question.
Okay.
Exactly, yeah.
All right.
So a related question from Mark Hickson. Thanks for your excellent presentation, Chip. How do you sustain your own active hope, replenishing personally the energy to fight the good fight, no matter the ultimate outcome?
Yeah. Well, I'm grieving.
Hmm.
Al Gore's second movie. I was on a 2-person panel in front of 250 people at the Honolulu Art Museum. They have a great big auditorium in there. And the leader of the panel, the moderator, gave me the microphone and said, well, what do you think about that movie? And I started crying. And I didn't stop crying. I just said, excuse me, and I had to leave. So I've got big time PTSD. Absolutely. But it's not about hope, it's about optimism. And where do you find optimism? It's in action. So doing what I've been doing for the last hour is really where I find a lot of optimism. This feeds me. You guys have allowed me to live another day staving off depression. The other thing is that hope is not the right emotion to have, because that's expecting someone else to solve this problem for you. There's all sorts of action you can take. You can not order that thing from Amazon. You can change your diet just a little bit. You don't have to. I went vegan for 2 years and I put on 30 pounds. So, that didn't work. Because I don't cook, I snack. And so I was perpetually hungry. So I backed off of that a little bit. But there are lots of things you can do. And with everything you do, you will find hope. And again, voting is the big one. So go to the politicians' rallies and money-raising events and raise your hand and say, what are you going to do about the drought that's hitting Hawaii? How are we going to catch the rain that falls before it runs off in the ocean? What are we going to do to adjust to the problems of climate change here, where I live and where I hope to have a family? Yeah.
Okay, we'll keep going. So Jeff Burgett asks, our expectations that we can keep going seems to be a big hurdle. Nobody in the global north wants less, even if that's key to survival. So what vision do we provide for a fulfilling future with less stuff?
Thanks, Jeff.
Marie Kondo, man, come on.
Jeff's an old friend. Yeah, I could give a talk which is about what is the future that you dream of? And I should, I suppose. But I'm still I want you guys to all suffer as much as I've suffered. I want to shock you out of complacency, because we all fall into complacency. Within 5 minutes of walking out of this talk, complacency will start to come in like a high tide. So I really want this talk to be a shocker, and for it to change a few neurons so that there is some evolution of your attitude towards the world. But this is an opportunity. This is an opportunity to build a clean, safe, inclusive, equitable, and just future. Having our world reach true sustainability doesn't mean we need to return to living in tents and mud huts and caves. We can have a gleaming digital world. It's just that we need to figure out how our construction and our economic growth needs to be primarily and almost entirely recycling. Maintaining, recycling, repurposing, and building things that are designed to be recycled and maintained. We can have lots of economic opportunities that way. So it's an opportunity for us. I'll have to put a few slides in on that.
You wanna go?
Yeah, I have a question. It's kind of, I see where you take this actually a little bit, like thinking about pushing ourselves and given all the cheerful news we've got today. I'm curious about, like, back actually to my friend's comment over here with the income inequality, and actually related to the military. And when you start to kind of pull things together, talking about imperialism, and talking about population growth, and I kind of would push back a little bit. I think that population growth isn't exactly the right message because of the big disparity in consumption. But also back to income equality is that when you actually are coming up with solutions that you're providing, talking about, like, say, military picking up hammers and what we're really getting at is it's wealth redistribution. And that's what I'm hearing, right?
Yeah.
And so
that's what a carbon tax is as well.
Right, it's wealth redistribution. And I guess what my question would be then is, can we push harder on the fact that we are running up against a huge power structure, in the sense that the economic system, this extractive economy that we depend on, is in fact built on scarcity, built on waste, whether that's nature or human lives. And so acknowledging like, what is the system that we have to put in place to overcome that, and the struggle that we have to undertake to overcome that, you know, what is that really gonna look like, you know? And again, is it voting, or is it really like changing what our political options are in that?
Did you read the paper?
I haven't, I need to go read the
Okay, so
paper.
it ends with all that stuff.
Yeah,
It's a cultural shift.
but that's why I'm pretty much, I think it's
And the-
economic.
the
because in
solution
sense that you're
to-
like, what you're saying is you have to overcome that, the power.
Yeah, all of these problems have a million solutions that need to be put in place. Overpopulation or okay, I agree, it's not a good term, but let's look at the rise of the human population on the planet. It has been very rapid. What's the solution to that? Woman's equity, female education, giving women power and autonomy over their own reproductive rights. There are too many matriarchal societies where that isn't the case. And it's been proved over and over again that female education takes us out of, producing 8 kids. Also, increases in the technology of food production takes us away from, what do you do with those 8 kids? Why'd you have 8 kids? Well, it's so that they can grow food and work on the farm. So there are just a zillion things that have to be done, and you guys are being taught all of them. They're out there in the literature. There's no single golden spike other than voting.
Right, but I guess what I'm kind of questioning, are we like dancing around the fact that like we're identifying capitalism here as like this sort of, so when you talk about wealth
I'm
redistribution.
full on pointing the finger at capitalism.
Right, so then is the solution then, are we afraid to say socialism? Like my question, like, is that really where you have to go because you need an economic?
Bring on Finland.
Yeah. So it's 4 o'clock. This is a lively discussion and there's still more chats, but I think we'll leave it at that, and folks can follow up with you and chat in the Pauhana afterwards, and I'll save the chat and give it to you if you feel like responding to the others.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you.